Have you tried enhancing dry embossing with embossing powder? In this video, I show you how. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. Today I have a tag to share with you using two types of embossing. Dry embossing with an embossing folder and then enhancing it with embossing powder. So let's get started. I have taken the Terrific Tags dies and I've cut one of the tags from black cardstock. I've cut two. I'm going to use one later and one now. So the first one here is going to go inside the embossing folder that comes in the Craft Your Life Project Kit Silk Art. This is such a pretty embossing folder, and I just added the embossing towards the left hand side, and you can see that dimension there. It's just really pretty. I am going to kind of bring out the embossing more by adding some ink over the top. So I'm using Persian blue pigment ink, and although this is dark cardstock, because it's pigment ink, it is going to show up. It's not going to show up as bright blue as it would on white cardstock, but it is going to show up slightly on the black cardstock, and it's just going to bring out that embossing so that you can see it a little bit more. I think this would work with lots of different colours, but I am going to add some rose gold embossing powder over this, and I felt like the blue would work quite nicely with the rose gold. I really love rose gold with black, but I just wanted to add that kind of extra little colour as well. But like I said, I think lots of other kind of colour combinations would work quite nicely with this. So I'm using a foam ink blending tool. That's just my preferred way of adding the ink on top of the embossing. But there are lots of different ways that you could do it. You definitely could just go directly to the cardstock with an ink pad, but because I've got that area to the right hand side without any embossing, I was worried that I would get quite a lot of ink onto it. But you could also maybe use a brayer or something like that as well, and I think that that would work quite nicely. But I'm just kind of dabbing this pigment ink over the top, and you can see here I think it just looks really pretty actually as is, but I am going to add a little bit more lightness over the top. This is the Caribbean Sky Pigment Ink, or Caribbean Sky if you're not British, that's how you would pronounce it. And this is just going to lighten it up slightly. When the pigment ink does dry, it does dry a little bit duller, but it does kind of sit on top of that surface, which is great so that you can see it on the dark cardstock. I did get a little bit of extra pigment ink where I didn't want it, so I'm just using a dry cloth to try and remove some of that. And then I do want to heat set that pigment ink because it does take a little while to dry. If I add it embossing powder on top of it now, the embossing powder is just going to completely cover all of that pigment ink, and I don't want that. I just want to add it in a few separate areas. So I'm just waving that heat gun around. I don't want to completely dry it, but I want it to be dry enough, like I said, so that embossing powder doesn't completely stick to it. I'm then taking embossing ink, which is a clear sticky ink, and a detailed blending brush, and I'm just using that brush to kind of dab on the embossing ink in just certain areas. I wanted the leaves to have quite a lot of the embossing powder on it, but I didn't want the flower to have too much, and I'm just kind of dabbing it on. I don't really want to cover it too much. I want it to kind of look a bit kind of speckled, a bit kind of gilded in a way. And I do think the result is really pretty, but it's definitely not one that you can control too much. So I'm taking the rose gold crisp embossing powder here, and I could just pour out all of the embossing powder over it, but again I wasn't 100% sure how much that pigment ink was dry. So I'm just using a little spoon here to try and kind of control where I'm adding the embossing powder, and just trying to dab it on in some of the areas that I know that I've added that embossing ink onto. So just taking my time here, and then I can tap off some of that excess and then just add a little bit more on in certain areas. If the pigment ink is still a little bit wet, then some of that embossing powder is going to stick, and actually I'm quite happy with that because it's quite nice just to have sort of kind of like speckles everywhere. I don't really want it to be too harsh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with a dry paintbrush here and just kind of speckle that through that embossing powder so that it's not going to be too opaque, and you're going to have some sort of areas in between. And like I said, it's kind of going to look a little bit more like gilding. I think it is really quite pretty. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've tried this technique before. I have done a few times kind of like an ombre look, and I think it does look really quite pretty, and I have tried it on embossing folders before as well, and again I think it looks really pretty, especially like on the raised areas. This embossing folder hasn't got too many sort of different heights to it. It's mainly sort of one layer, but I still think it looks like kind of works really quite well with this technique, especially since the rest of the tag in this instance is flat. It really brings out that dry embossing as well. So I'm just going to go through here and just sort of add extra bits on where I think I might want some. And actually you can kind of sprinkle it on and see if, even if it's not that wet, when you add the heat gun to it, sometimes the heat gun will just blow the embossing powder off, but sometimes it will actually melt it as well. So you kind of get a different look depending on how much you've added on top. So I'm just bringing in my heat tool here, and I'm going to heat set that until it's completely melted. I don't want to warp the tag, so I'm moving my heat gun away after each section and then bringing it back, and that works quite well just to not warp the tag. Although I'm doing it on a tag today, this would work really nicely on a card as well. I then want to heat emboss a sentiment, so I'm bringing the Silk Art project kit back, and I'm using the sentiment from the stamp set here, and I actually just want the sentiment to say hello rather than just wanted to say hello. So I'm masking that off with some satin masking tape. I'm then going to stamp that onto some black cardstock. So I'm going to prep the cardstock with an anti-static powder tool, remove the excess, and then I can ink up that stamp with embossing ink. Press that down. I did remove the masking tape first and then press that down onto the cardstock, being quite light-handed, and then I can apply that same rose gold crisp embossing powder, and this time I do want a really nice crisp look rather than more of a kind of mottled look. And then once that's cool, I can cut that down into a strip. I've then taken the tag that I cut initially, and I'm just adding some glue tape on the back of that, and then I can add it onto the back of the embossed tag. That's going to make it so that I've got a nice flat area for me to write a message on the back of the tag. I'm then taking some instant dimension foam tape, and I've just cut a small amount of that I can put on the back of my sentiment piece. But because my project is completely black, my cardstock tag is black, and then also my sentiment, I didn't really want there to be a chance that you might be able to see the white foam kind of peeking through. So I'm taking a black marker here, and I'm kind of just painting the sides of that foam tape. This is a really great trick if you don't happen to have black foam tape and you've got a completely black project. I think it's quite nice to do that. I did get ink all over my fingers, which was a bit unfortunate, but that will clean off no problem. I'm then going to add my sentiment then onto the tag. Ordinarily I would probably add it over a focal point. I like to do that personally quite often, but this time I thought I would have it over to the right. I'm then just going to take some twine, add that through the top of the tag, and then I can tie it in a bow at the front. I think this tag would work really nicely added to a card base, but I did just want to keep it as a standalone tag. I thought it'd be quite nice to add onto a parcel or something like that. I do like having standalone tags kind of ready to go so that I can add them onto a card base if I wanted to, or like I said, add them to a gift or something like that. But this technique, like I said, I think works really nicely on a card, kind of like a standalone card as well. I'm then just going to finish off by adding some copper jewels from my stash. It's just going to bring out that rose gold embossing powder. So I'm just adding a few around the embossing and then also that sentiment as well. And I really like how that rose gold just kind of glistens in the light. I think it's really pretty against that black cardstock. And so that's the tag finished for today. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Hello there, crafty friend, Lydia here. Just popping in to say that you can get your daily dose of crafting tips, techniques and tutorials just like this by subscribing to the Altenew YouTube channel. All you need to do is click on that little bell up there and you will never miss a video. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.